And these questions are actually a lot harder than, is it a sin for a woman to be an astronaut? Yes or no? Just tell me.
Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. I am Jen and this is Fundy Fridays, and here on my channel I usually do my makeup while talking about different aspects of Christian fundamentalism. And I'm not gonna lie, kind of procrastinated on this episode and I don't have a lot of time to edit it and put it out. So I'm not doing my makeup in this one. Today we are talking about the Botkins. They are a family from Tennessee that were heavily affiliated with the now defunct Vision Forum. For more information about Vision Forum, go ahead and watch my other video about it, but I will be talking a lot about it today, so don't worry, I will catch you up. The Botkins are a family of pseudo-intellectual fundamentalist Christians. Their father Jeffrey, son Lucas, and daughters Anna, Sophia, and Elizabeth have produced a variety of condescending, overambitious video lectures over the past decade, covering everything from uncomfortable father-daughter relationships, uncomfortable alt-right hot takes, to uncomfortable Call of Duty-style gun porn montages. No, I'm not joking. We'll be talking about the adult children of this family a little bit later on in the video, but first, let's talk about Jeff, because he's the patriarch, and in those kinds of circles, these men are so pathetic that really it's all they have, so let's go ahead and talk about him first. Jeff Botkin comes from the tradition of the Great Commission group, which has a problematic history, to say the least. They have very similar beliefs to the Vision Forum group and IBLP and the IFB, and that's on purpose. I believe that a lot of those movements were directly inspired by this Great Commission group.
The religious system that developed from Jim McCotter's efforts quickly became an aberrant group, getting caught up in the peripheral aspects of the Christian faith by focusing on pet doctrines, performance standards, and a demanding submission to church authorities. There were many other churches that developed in the 1960s and 70s that fell into the same error, and this movement in evangelical Christianity became known as the Shepherding Discipleship Movement. Bill Gothard and Sovereign Grace Ministries are groups that advocate homeschooling as a religious right, groups that also classify as part of the shepherding discipleship ideology. According to the model framed by David Henke, these groups exemplify spiritual abuse because they manifest these hallmark signs. They are authoritarian, perfectionistic, image conscious, they squelch criticism of their system, they are elitist, and they are unbalanced in that they focus on peripheral doctrine rather than essential doctrines of the faith, veering off-center from Orthodox Christian teachings.
Even though his brother Greg left the Great Commission, Jeff Botkin continued his relationship with the Great Commission through/with Jim Cotter, pursuing McCotter's interest and teachings through 2002. I've seen no documentation that Jeff Botkin has ever renounced or recanted the teachings and harsh practices of the original Great Commission group that many Christians and former members, including Greg Botkin. In fact, Jeff Botkin promotes most of the original core messages of the Great Commission through his work at Vision Forum, including rigid performance standards for women, rigid courtship and arranged marriage, improper response to criticism, an elitist attitude, failing to distinguish between a biblical command, a general principle, and a personal preference, authoritarian and/or insensitive leadership, harsh church discipline, lack of emphasis on formal education, and a belief that every man should become an elder or prophet, priest, king of the home, as it is articulate by Vision Forum. Like I said, these beliefs have trickled down into the greater Fundy community. You know how much they love things that trickle down. At one point, Botkin moved his entire family to New Zealand. McCotter bought a seaside mansion in Christchurch, and Botkin named his quiverful home Seven Arrows Ranch. Botkin became CEO for this multimedia organization, which also eventually acquired a magazine, one that which the Western Conservatory, Botkin's current business venture, calls an international media conglomerate. They published a newspaper that published 3 times per week and aired Christian programming at the TV station. Within 2 years, all but the Fashion and Style magazine failed financially. McCotter left New Zealand, and Botkin resigned his position in 2002. Wow, I didn't even know that they had a fashion and lifestyle magazine. I really hope the sisters were running it, because I refuse to take fashion advice from a guy that dresses like he's going to shake your hand a little too hard at the company luncheon. Some of his many lies include ripping off the testimony of somebody else, claiming that he grew up a Marxist, a lie that their sisters repeat in their book Visionary Daughters. I have a copy of Visionary Daughters, the book written by the Botkin sisters. They are constantly talking about Marxism. Marx was a German philosopher who lived about the same time as Abraham Lincoln. He was a Satanist whose objective in life, in his own words, was to dethrone God and destroy capitalism. He absolutely hated fatherhood and daughterhood. He hated patriarchy. He hated the concept of submission and honor to God-ordained authority. He hated everything about the father-daughter relationship that was nourished and modeled in the family. He believed the family stood in the way of his ambitions to replace Christianity with international socialism. His life's work was fueled by an extraordinary hatred of God's order. Today, Marx has millions of followers, on Instagram, who help keep his hatred alive. Most of these followers are women who continue to help Marx with a kind of daughterly loyalty. Isn't that ironic? More on their wonderful book a little bit later. Some other extraordinarily random lies that Jeff told was this one. Jeff is very vague about his past, boasting claims that sound impressive, mysterious, and fantastic at times, and there are many such exaggerations noted on his Western Conservatory website. One such notable one is that his son consulted with John Hopkins to assist the Navy with undersea warfare, which seems quite implausible. Young Isaac likely had someone who worked for Hopkins help him with a homeschooling project at the ripe old age of 14. The website also boasts that Dr. Greg Botkin serves them as a scientist and as a chief of staff at a progressive hospital who participates in alternative energy research. I phoned the facility in Idaho where he works, and he is not chief of staff there, but is an emergency department physician who oversees rehabilitation services and continuing medical education at this small community hospital. Certainly, this does not diminish the accomplishments of either Isaac or Greg Botkin in any way, but it does point out the ability of Jeff Botkin to exaggerate, presumably to promote his marketability and image. My favorite, well, I guess I shouldn't say favorite. The thing that I hate the most about Jeff Botkin is just how creepy he is towards his daughters, and all daughters in general. This next segment is from Quiverful by Catherine Joyce. Another book that I highly recommend. I love Catherine Joyce, so let's get into it. There were complications when Jeffrey Botkin's first daughter, Anna Sophia, was born. The problems were physical. Anna Sophia's mother, Victoria, could have died, and more esoteric too. Jeffrey Botkin is one of the leading voices of a ministry called Vision Forum, the intellectual avant-garde of fundamentalism. One of Vision Forum's chief concerns is child-rearing, which the movement considers both a process of theological conditioning and an art lost sometime in the 19th century. So as Botkin held his newborn daughter perfectly still in his cupped hands, he prayed to God for guidance. After having raised two older sons, how should he raise a daughter? He felt God move him to a specific prayer for the infant sleeping in his hands, a prayer for her body. He remembered baby girls are born with 2 ovaries and a finite number of eggs that will last them a lifetime. He placed his hand over his new daughter's abdomen and prayed for Anna Sophia to be the future mother of tens of millions. He prayed that the Lord would order everything in his daughter's life, what you will do with every single egg here. How many children will this young lady have? Who will be her husband? With what other legacy will these little eggs be joined to produce the next generation for the glory of God? He explained to a room full of about 600 fathers and daughters gathered for an annual Vision Forum father and daughter retreat that he had prayed that his new daughter might marry young.
Mom, can you pick me up? I'm scared.
Jeff also believes that 5-year-olds are capable of being false prophets, so I'm starting to think that he just has really weird feelings about kids. I know what I said, and I meant every word of it.
Now, see, there's such a thing as false prophets who come enticing your children, and they can be very, very young. They can be 4 years old. They can be 5 years old. Jesus said, "Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks." Did you know little children can be a stumbling block to your children in the twinkling of an eye, in things that they say to your children, things that they show to your children, things that they introduce to your children? It is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. Jesus Christ has said this, and so parents, this is our warning. We've been warned. There will be stumbling blocks. Plan on it. There will be stumbling blocks at the church, at the meeting of the church, driving to the church, in your own home. There will be stumbling blocks. The one that is used by Satan to be the stumbling block, he's in big trouble, even if he's 5 years old.
Another really unfortunate thing that gets brought up a lot at Vision Forum is they like to victim blame. I mean, it's just a part of the culture, and when you know that, this next segment will make a lot of sense.
Concealment of a crime is itself a crime, he explained, warning listeners against being party to crimes through inaction. People have an obligation to intervene when they witness crimes, or at the very least to let out a hue and cry, Botkin argued. Shockingly, he even applied this line of thinking to rape victims. Quoting Deuteronomy 22:23 through 27, Botkin observed that in biblical times, a rape victim was to be executed if she didn't cry out. Why? Because it was in the city and she didn't cry out and a crime was committed. And so the cry is very important here, he said at the 59:31 mark. Botkin argued that a rape victim deserves death if she goes along with the crime. She cried out. She was not going to conceal the crime being committed. She cried out for help, and there was no one to help her. She's not guilty, but the man who committed the crime is. But if she goes along with the crime and does not cry out, then she's guilty too, and is worthy of death because it's a capital crime.
And remember, IBLP has a very similar teaching. They even have an entire wisdom booklet about how, you caused your brother to stumble. So keep that in mind. After the failure of Vision Forum, Jeff moved on and started another ministry, and that is the Western Conservatory of Arts and Sciences. And I've combed over every available inch of the Western Conservatory website, and it really does just seem to be another Jeff Botkin vanity project. It seems to have flamed out very quickly, probably because Jeff and his daughters are intolerably pompous and condescending in everything that they do. Jeff also runs Christ Kingdom Church. That church is on the same property as Jeff's house, the sisters, his in-laws, his sons, and then his son's business, T-Rex Arms. I don't know how else to describe it, but it looks like a compound, so that's good to know. Knowing all this, I bet you're wondering, well, what's he up to now?
All right. What does it take to be with a girl like Tommy Lauren? Tommy's too busy for texts, and so are her beautiful friends.
Never mind. I don't want to hear anymore. So if we're going to talk about Vision Forum, we have to talk about Doug Phillips, and he will be weaved in and out of this story, so I'm not going to give him a long dedicated section. Long story short, he was the founder of Vision Forum. Doug himself is obsessed with gender roles. He is a pariah and a rapist, and he is the reason that Vision Forum imploded. Although it is a good thing that Vision Forum isn't around anymore. This was just too much. Vision Forum's main concern was creating propaganda for gender roles and submission of women. They made toys and books and movies and did conferences and all kinds of things. Between the 1-2 punch of IBLP's umbrella of authority and Vision Forum's gender role propaganda machine, there shan't be a free thought in the whole quiver. Jeff and a few other families were considered to be the equivalent of fundy royalty in this culture. Anna Sophia and Elizabeth in particular were poised to be, princesses, I guess would be the correct. I'm not British. Other families considered high profile in this circle would be the Duggars, the Bairds, the Botkins, the Browns, and the Bradricks. More on them later. These were all Vision Forum poster families that were chosen to be a shining example that the rest of the families should aspire to. I bring up the Bairds specifically because after watching all of the footage I did of Anna and Elizabeth Botkin, I can clearly see the influence.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
But Bethy and Kristen eventually got the Prince Charmings that were promised to them by purity culture thought leaders like Josh Harris. In contrast, Anna and Elizabeth are in their mid-30s, still single, and living at home with their family, who, as you'll see, aren't the type of people that anybody would want to be spending 3 decades with. Now, obviously, there's nothing wrong with being single or living at home as an adult. I mean, no shade to anybody who's in that situation, especially in this economy. Sometimes your choice is either live with mom and dad or live in a van down by the river. But it's just too easy to roast the Botkin sisters for it, considering how they spent their entire teens and 20s lecturing girls that their entire purpose in life is to be a godly wife and mother.
Young women are encountering a wide gap between coming of age and the time when they marry, if they marry. Now Christian daughters are very seriously asking, what is a girl supposed to do with her single years?
We have observed that today's post-family society has a decidedly strong opinion about this. Today's girls tend to follow the demands of today's culture to achieve its definition of popularity and success, measured by public acclaim, college degrees, and big paychecks. Marriage and family are not central to this vision of success.
The culture of Vision Forum is, I don't know how to say. It's not the vibe. Here's another passage from So Much More, the remarkable influence of visionary daughters on the kingdom of God. Why do I have an innate need for male affection, love, and protection? Because that's how God created women to be. We will not be able to understand our own needs and desires and strengths and how we ought to relate to our fathers until we understand the original relationship God created between men and women. We would not exist but for men. Man was our source. Man was formed from dust. But woman had her origin and being from man and for man. And it is because we were created from the rib of a man that we have an innate, inbuilt desire to be restored to that side of man. God created men to be more than just optional lifestyle accessories. He created women to be dependent on them in a good way. Complete independence from a man would go against the very order of God's creation. Every woman's life is built around men and men's role and leadership in some way. This is true for the parasitical women who live like leeches off men and whose lives revolve around attracting men, and for the diehard feminists who dedicate their lives to proving that they don't need men, and for the godly, virtuous women who understand that submitting to God means joyfully submitting to the authority He has placed over them. Take Betty Friedan, the author of Feminine Mystique, America's premier feminist. Even she couldn't escape from her own inerrant nature as a helpmeet. She spent her whole professional life advancing the agenda of Karl Marx and his disciples. The modern feminist movement was designed by these men, as we'll see in Chapter 6. Well-Defined and the Botkins make womanhood feel like a consolation prize. No, you can't lead in church, but you can help out with the bake sale. You can't have a job, but you can help your dad with accounting. And you can't go to college, but you can read all the books you want. So, isn't being second best fun?
Rather than indulging in selfishness and pursuing my own success in selfish ambitions, this is very good training for me to see what it's like to submit in this particular way to a man.
Part of the submission training in this culture is to have the girls prepared to serve their future husbands by practicing on their dad.
Paul tells Timothy, appeal to the older men as you would a father, kind of implying that this is something that you have learned how to do with a father. You know how to do this with your dad, right? So this is what you do with other older men. And so this is something that we need to learn how to do.
Rest in hell, Sigmund Freud. You would have loved Vision Forum. So after practicing on your dad, you're finally allowed to submit to your husband. And after you say I do, you're granted the freedom of being under your husband's authority. An immediate handoff that is designed to ensure that the women of this faith do not get a moment to themselves. They are always under the control of whatever man is their next of kin.
But biblically, my responsibility toward my daughter leads up to her marriage. It leads up to the time when I entrust her to another man.
Now, where have I seen this before?
The way God ordained it all, Josh becomes the authority at the wedding. He becomes her authority, not me. And that's the way God designed the transfer of authority. And it's a good design.
In my nightmares. Another vital pillar of fundamentalism is the idea of being separate from the secular world, and media that daughters receive from childhood on as it pertains to their future role. The Botkin sisters received no Barbie dolls, idols that aspire girls to lead selfish lives, but rather a doll estate that could help them learn to manage a household of assets, furniture, and servants in the aristocratic version of Quiverful Life, which Botkin paints for their families around the room. The toys that girls played with were tools for dominion, such as kitchen utensils and other tools for the laboratory, the kitchen. The blatant sexism of Vision Forum truly knows no bounds, often veering headfirst into blatant abuse. R.C. Sproul Jr. tells the story of a family friend whose homeschooled 9-year-old daughter still could not read. Does that make you uncomfortable, he asks? Are you thinking, mercy, what would the superintendent say if he knew? But my friend went on to explain. She doesn't know how to read, but every morning she gets up and gets ready for the day. Then she takes care of her 3 youngest siblings. She takes them potty, and then she cleans and dresses them, makes their breakfast, brushes their teeth, clears their dishes, and makes their beds. Now I saw her rightly as an overachiever. If she didn't know how to read, but she did know all the Looney Tunes characters, that would be a problem. But here is a young girl being trained to be a keeper of the home. Do I want her to read? Of course I do. But this little girl was learning what God requires, to be a help in the family business, with a focus on tending the garden. Practices like these normalize and legitimize abuse over time, ensuring that with each new generation it becomes harder and harder for the women to escape. It is truly remarkable what people will put up with when they think that everybody else is doing the same thing too. The Botkin daughters, raised in both the American South and the Botkin Seven Arrows Ranch in New Zealand, stressed the dire importance of one of their father's favorite talking points: multi-generational faithfulness, cleaving to the ways of their parents and not abandoning the Dominion project the older generation has begun. They're trying to take over, I'm telling you. The Vision Forum elites, particularly the Botkins, were obsessed with their understanding of yesteryear. In this context, you can think of yesteryear as a mysterious and vague time period where men wore pirate shirts and women were property. What's important is that the Vision Forum big boys wanted to be household heads with God-given authority that could not be challenged. Ironically, I suspect that these delusional wannabe patriarchs would have no doubt been peasants in the real yesteryear, and seeing as how they're anti-vax, they were probably pretty excited for this most recent pandemic. It helps their cosplay be more realistic. Have any of you seen the new NBC show, The Courtship? Actually, how much do you want to bet that Paul and Morgan are going to do a series about it? Please report back in the comments, because I guarantee you they're going to, because I want to be right. I'm always right. I have a personal crackpot theory that everybody at Vision Forum got their historical costumes from this woman named Jenny Chansey, who was quoted earlier in the video. She's an educated, quiverful anti-feminist activist, aka the perfect hire for the Vision Forum propaganda machine. Jenny runs ladiesagainstfeminism.com, which is exactly what you think it is, but more interesting than that is her company Sense and Sensibility Clothing, which is an online shop that sells patterns for historical costumes, which is actually really cool. Jenny is really creative, and I can tell that she's intelligent. I just wish that she wasn't such an insufferable bitch.
I get a lot of letters from women who are newlyweds who say, I don't even know how to boil water. My mother was a feminist. I don't know how to raise kids. I don't know how to cook. Who am I supposed to learn this from now? College didn't teach me this. What am I supposed to do?
Jenny was also in another Vision Forum movie called The Monstrous Regiment of Women, which was at the San Antonio Christian Independent Film Festival run by Vision Forum. Here's a clip of that.
The goal of feminism from the beginning has been to change the family unit. We don't want the father in charge earning the bread and the mom staying at home with the kids. We want it flipped. We want moms to be able to go out in the workforce. In fact, we'd rather have both parents gone and the children in the hands of the state. And again, that just traces right back to Marxism and socialism. It's far better for the state to run everything and decide how our lives will be than for individual families to have that autonomy.
The irony of this whole thing is that these fundamentalists try to convince us that it's godless socialism that is bringing about the downfall of society, when in reality, if we had universal healthcare, childcare, housing, and transportation, then more families would actually be able to stay home and raise their kids as God intended. Are you an average dude with an inferiority complex? Do you like to boss around women and children? Are you looking for a lifestyle where you get rewarded for the bare minimum? Perhaps Christian patriarchy is for you. Okay, my camera died. I'm sorry. I'm gonna use the webcam now. On stage, the sisters explain to an audience of fathers and daughters, young women to very young girls, the ways in which daughters should go beyond a lukewarm acceptance of biblical femininity to a full-on embrace of a deliberately countercultural girlhood. They should be modest servants who don't cause their brothers in Christ to stumble with the temptation. They should learn to ignore their comfort zone in the interest of a higher calling. They should wear feminine clothes to prove to their fathers that they are virtuous women worthy of protection. They should not learn career skills as emergency backups to support themselves, as learning to survive can teach girls attitudes of independence. They should understand that singleness is a very rare calling from God, so they should prepare to marry and conduct a war on the home front. In other words, they must understand there is no opting out of this revolution without turning their backs on the faith. But most of all, the Botkins explain, a virtuous daughter should turn her heart to her father in the spirit of Malachi 4:6. One day, while Father Botkin was entertaining a, quote, very important political leader, he called his daughter. Anna Sophia, then 5 or 6, came into the room to untie and remove her father's shoes, and she then asked the guest if she could untie his shoes as well. Years later, Jeffrey Botkin says the politicians brought the event up, telling Botkin, "You know, when I decided we should have more children, it was that night your sweet little daughter helped me with my shoes." One simple act of hospitality had eternal consequences. Such lessons are repeated wide-scale at the father-daughter retreats, where daughters are are given object lessons alongside the sermons through a series of ideological games, including a blindfolded obstacle course where chains of blinded daughters were guided solely by relying on their father's verbal commands, contests for fathers wooing and winning the hearts of their daughters, and intimacy-building unity games that teach daughters to serve their fathers by shaving their faces, grooming their hair, and knotting their shoes and ties. As three of Philip's young daughters, Jubilee, Liberty, and Faith, explained on a video posted on Vision Forum's website, each of the games was designed to teach us a principle about our relationship with our father. The Botkin sisters aim to validate living a life of confinement with a staunch, if unfounded, beliefs regarding college. College campuses have become dangerous places of anxiety, wasted years, mental defilement, and moral derangement, they write. Although neither of the sisters has attended college, they also claim universities are hotbeds of Marxism that forbid a free exchange of ideas and seek to indoctrinate students in leftist thinking. Elsewhere, they quote a document from the pro-patriarchy website Fathers for Life that states that the prime purposes of feminism are to establish a lesbian socialist republic and to dismantle the family unit, echoing Pat Robertson's notorious statement that feminism is a socialist anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Comment below if I should make lesbian socialist republic merch. Wives, they go on to claim, have the ability to win over their husbands with respectful and submissive behavior, and daughters have the same responsibility. Before you can accuse your father of being unprotective, ask yourself, do you make it clear to him that you are a woman of virtue worthy of his special protection? If your behavior was more gentle, feminine, respectful, and lovely, would he be more inclined to be protective of you? Relationships with mothers, by contrast, get little consideration within the literature and blogs of the stay-at-home daughters movement. Mother-daughter dynamics are mentioned in the Botkins book and film only in the context of readers becoming future mothers. So all of this brings me to the Botkins magnum opus, Return of the Daughters.
In the 20th century, women made decisions that resulted in the weakening of families and the demoralization of the next generation of young women.
Now, in the 21st century, it has become very difficult to be a young woman. Thanks to America's legacy of militant feminism, girls are confused about where they fit into the world, even into their own families. They're confused about what it means to be a woman. Perhaps most of all, they're confused about how to deal with a new byproduct of feminism, prolonged singleness.
Is feminism the reason for your prolonged singleness?
And I tell you, there's nothing like an unexpected 15-year extension of singleness to really force you to grapple with womanhood and God's plan for your life.
And you know their creepy-ass dad had something to say about this.
What are you doing to help her become the kind of girl who says, Dad, tell me more about what is important. Tell me more about how I can strengthen and preserve the faith and extend it to many future generations once I'm married. Help me get ready for the calling of womanhood. Help me identify a real man and a real leader I can work with as my life work. A husband who understands leadership like you do, Dad, who recognizes the high office of womanhood and motherhood, and who knows what it means to lay his life down for me like you do, who knows how to protect me and provide for me like you do, who knows how to lead gently and sacrificially and patriarchally like you do. I can tell you there are fathers and daughters out there right now who have this kind of relationship, and it's getting better year by year. Also, there are young men out there who are very intrigued by this for the right reasons.
There are a couple other people in this movie that I want to talk about. First and foremost is the Bradricks.
Peter Bradrick knew enough about Kelly's family to privately express his interest to Kelly's father and to ask his advice about a potential courtship.
For several months, Peter worked through a thorough evaluation process with Kelly's father. During this time, Kelly had no idea that Peter had approached her father and was going through a series of interviews with him, writing theological papers for him, and answering the hard questions only a future father-in-law can ask.
The story of the Bradricks' courtship and marriage and babies is a huge part of the Return of the Daughters movie.
At age 21, Kelly Brown made the transition from being a daughter in her father's house to a bride in her husband's house. A year later and 9 months pregnant, she couldn't be more grateful for the foundation she laid in her unmarried years.
All of my life I was preparing for this, so I knew the types of things that I would be doing as a wife and a helpmeet. I knew the types of responsibilities that would be had, and so I spent my years as a daughter in my father's household and under the tutelage of my mother, preparing for those things. And so it was very easy. I understood what my role was going to be, and transitioning from one to the other was very easy.
With all this to do about their relationship, I'm dying to know, what does Peter bring to the table? I mean, he sounds like he's got to be a catch.
The young men I know, they're looking for daughters that are serious about the Word of God, that are studying the Word of God under their father's tutelage, and want to spend the days in their father's household as a virgin, focused on deepening their relationship with the Lord.
Peter Bradrick was also on the receiving end of a very interesting bromance between himself and Doug Phillips. Doug famously married Peter and Kelly and had this to say about their very special first kiss. I had the glorious ringside seat to the very first romantic kiss in the life of both the groom and the bride. This is now the 4th or 5th time in my life that I have had the privilege of watching such a first kiss. They represent the blessing of God on the faithfulness of parents, their children, and the children yet to be born, who will drink deeply from the testimonies of those who went before them. Finally, they are biblical kisses. I call them biblical kisses because these kisses, as much as any part of the wedding ceremony, other than the vows themselves, restore the biblical imagery of the marriage covenant to its beautiful representation of the eternal, holy groom and his spotless bride. Body and soul, bride and groom have kept themselves only for each other. So what are the Bradricks up to now? Divorced? All right, never mind. And I want you all to know that I'm very messy, and I found Peter on Facebook. He sells real estate, and he's got pictures of the kids, and I checked his friends list, and there are no Botkins in there, so that's interesting. Peter married Kelly, and Kelly's dad is Scott Brown. Scott Brown is the director of the National Center for Family Integrated Churches, which was originally a part of Vision Forum. Now it's an independent organization, but they still have the same exact beliefs, and they're doing the same exact shit that Vision Forum did, with just a different name. Another family that was featured in this movie was the Baucham family, and their dad is Voddie, and he's something else.
Interestingly enough, the Bible doesn't command women to become independent, it commands them to be submissive. Why? Well, because part of the curse in Genesis chapter 3 is that Eve would have a desire, not just for her husband, but literally in the Hebrew for her husband's position. It is part of the fallen nature as a result of what happened with our first parents, that women have this desire against the order that God ordained toward independence. So for me to foster that in my daughter is really for me to flirt with that very same thing that brought Eve down. And so what I need to foster in my daughter is not the sin to which she's prone. I need to foster the biblical pattern that she must learn.
That's pretty bad, but wait till you hear from his daughter, Jasmine.
I don't even think I can describe to you what a stigma it is to be a double minority, both a woman and a Black woman at that, always living with this voice inside of you that says, you walk into a room and you're thinking, whether people are thinking it or not, you're thinking, I have to prove myself. I'm as smart as anybody else in here. I'm as capable as anybody else in here. And I have to prove that. I have to stand tall and talk loudly. And in my household, I don't have to feel like a double minority. When I get married, I never have to feel like a double minority. I never have to stand up and proclaim to the hilltops, well, I'm a Black woman, but look at me, hear me roar. I'm just as smart as anybody else and watch me succeed. All I have to do is what I'm called to do. It's to serve my father and later to serve my husband. That's been freeing for me.
I mean, it's pretty clear that Jasmine is somebody who is not used to being listened to, and I think it's important that we take the time to hear what she has to say. What she's talking about, the burden of representing your race at all times, is something that I've never had to deal with, and I recognize that that is a privilege that I have as a white woman in America, and it sucks that our society, and the fundamentalist community especially, is so fucking racist that Jasmine feels the need to retreat into total submission to her father as a way to finally get some respect. There's a lot of discourse on how religion and religious trauma intersect with other classes of oppression, and this is called intersectionality, and it is very important to the conversations of deconstruction, anti-racism work, and other areas of social justice. Jasmine is onto something, for sure, but I have neither the time nor the expertise to unpack all of that at this moment. There's not much I can add to this at this very moment, except to say that America needs to do better at listening to Black people, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Jasmine is all grown up now. She works for the Gospel Coalition, and she is married with several children. And despite saying otherwise in the movie, she did pursue several degrees, and she is quite intelligent. She is a conservative Christian, but she does not appear to be hardcore IFB. Her dad is something else.
From Baucham's November 4th, 2007 speech on corporal punishment. Spank your kids, okay? And they desperately need to be spanked, and they need to be spanked often. They do. I meet people all the time, and they say, they have only been maybe 4 or 5 times I've ever had to spank Junior. That's unfortunate, because unless you raised Jesus too, there were days where Junior needed to be spanked 5 times before breakfast. If you spanked your child 5 times, then that means almost every time they disobeyed you, you let it go. Why do your toddlers throw fits? Because you've taught them that's the way they can control you. When instead you just need to have an all-day session where you just wear them out and they finally decide, you know what, things get worse when I do that.
He's also contributed troubling quotes like this.
A lot of men are leaving their wives for younger women because they yearn for attention from younger women, and God gave them a daughter who can give them that. And instead they go find a substitute daughter. You've seen it, we've all seen it. These old guys going and finding these substitute daughters.
And he is currently working on a documentary called Uncle Tom Part 2, a sequel to Larry Elder's 2020 movie Uncle Tom, and no, I am not kidding. I really wish I was. And then another person that was in the movie was Lourdes Torres, and I'm not going to play her segment because it just feels wrong for some reason. If you didn't know, she was a nanny for Doug Phillips, and for years he groomed and sexually assaulted her, and she courageously came forward and sued him, but nothing came of it. That unfortunately happens a lot in these circles. Doug has not faced justice to this day. Vision Forum has, of course, shut down, and Doug's whereabouts are really all over the place. He hangs out with burlesque dancers, which there's nothing wrong with. It's just weird that he's there. And he does, like, events for World War II veterans, and he still does historical costumes and makes stupid little movies. After disappearing for about 15 years, the Botkins sisters have resurfaced.
I'm Anna Botkin. This is my sister Elizabeth. We are 33 and 35. Just going to be just full disclosure. Some of you may know us by a book that we wrote 15 years ago called So Much More, where we attempted to really explain what single young womanhood was about. And in the 15 years since then, we've learned and grown, thankfully, and have learned that it was about a lot more things than we thought. And a lot of us have grown up hearing phrases like, marriage and motherhood are a woman's highest calling. We've read books or seen books on biblical womanhood that were, presenting motherhood and wifehood as what biblical womanhood means and what it's all about. And it can be very difficult when you hit 35 and you realize that you don't fit into your own worldview.
Well, I can't say this for sure. I feel like the Botkin sisters are grieving a life that they wanted to live so desperately for so long as a wife and mother. But because of their weird dad scaring off potential suitors and the internalized misogyny drilled into their psyche, they are stuck living a life that they hate and which we all know that they believe to be against their true feminine purpose.
And there's no shame in feeling pain over not having a good thing that the Lord has said is a good thing to desire. It's a good thing to have, but He hasn't given it. He's not given it to us. And we can say on the one hand this is good, and yet on the other hand, and yet it is still painful.
I mean, they're still, really condescending.
And we reject things like radical autonomy.
The Botkin sisters haven't updated their website since 2018, and what remains is nothing to write home about. They have a couple of posts about victim blaming and preparing for a life of singleness, so that's fun. And I did stalk both of them on Facebook, and Anna works at her local Chamber of Commerce, and Elizabeth is working for her brother, Lucas, who we're going to talk about right now. Lucas Botkin, he founded T-Rex Arms, which is a company that makes accessories for guns, and he helped film the motion capture for Call of Duty. It looks like he's supporting the whole family with this business, and he has a wife who's pretty secular. But the main thing about Lucas is that he's a huge loser, and everybody makes fun of him online because he does these like exaggerated video shoots where he's trying to look really cool, and he tries to give advice about shooting and all these different things, and he doesn't have any military or law enforcement experience. experience, yet he's acting like he's, you know, like a fucking Navy SEAL or something. He went on Snapchat, it looks like, and he posted about how much he hated this gay person that he was seeing, and he called them the F slur. And because of that scandal, Modlight, a company that makes tactical flashlights for firearms, released a statement distancing themselves from T-Rex arms. Jeff has a son named Ben, and he has a wife named Audrey, and they have since left the church and kind of have a public falling out with Jeff. I know Audrey goes on Twitter and she talks about her experience with having Jeff as a father-in-law. When it comes to the Botkins and Vision Forum, it's not all tea parties and purity balls. There's a lot of significant sexual abuse that's going on, amongst other terrible, terrible things. The way that this ministry defines father-daughter relationships with total dependence and submission leaves the door wide open for any kind of abuse a perverted patriarch could ever dream of. It also conveniently strips away any resource a daughter would have to otherwise defend themselves from such abuse. Vision Forum takes an otherwise wholesome and loving relationship between father and daughter and perverts it, and I chose that word on purpose. Fathers absolutely can and should play an important role in the lives of their children, but not like this. What Jeff, Voddie, Scott, and all these other men want is not to be a doting father raising well-rounded children. It is to be a god within their own home, and they seek to enforce that structure with rigid, inalienable birthrights that will forever leave a daughter a second-class citizen, whether it be in her father's home or her husband's. Because of the history of patriarchal leaders abusing the girls and women that trust them most in their lives, everything is tainted. Like, I guess if it wasn't for all the abuse, maybe this, like, daddy-daughter stuff wouldn't be as weird, but having conferences to shave daddy and dedicate your purity to him is weird no matter what the context. In fact, I can't even think of a single context where it wouldn't be weird. What the fuck is wrong with these people? The Botkin sisters were absolutely groomed to be the figureheads of this movement, and I believe that nobody could have predicted that it was going to detonate the way that it did. The Botkins achieved a prominent status in the Vision Forum community, and while I do think this is partly because they were set up by their dad, I also believe just a little bit that the Botkin sisters enjoyed the sense of superiority that came with their role.
And we need to be honest with ourselves too about like how much we even personally adopted a view of marriage or a view of womanhood that that was actually small, because that's actually what we wanted. And it was not even so much because this is exactly what we were taught, but because we liked the idea of pursuing something that was, you know, the Lord's vision for womanhood that was actually kind of our vision for womanhood. And that was going to be about having a handsome husband and adorable children and a house to decorate. Because as good as marriage is, and as good as motherhood is, and being a home manager, we can desire all of those things in a very selfish way. And our desires can be more fueled by a Hollywood vision of romance than by the gospel. And we've got to be really honest with ourselves about what is really driving us.
Anna and Elizabeth were told that if they followed all the rules and handed their autonomy over to Papa Jeff, everything would work out as God/Dad intended. From their latest video, it appears they still believe in the same IFB talking points that they always have, like anti-feminism, Christian dominionism, homophobia, biblical gender roles, etc. I am not letting them off the hook, especially now.
But I will just say that there are recourses in a situation like that don't have to look like her becoming a full-blown feminist who's throwing off all authority and throwing off everything her parents taught her and running in the opposite direction. It does not have to look like that. It must not look like that.
These girls were used as the poster children for the perfect Vision Forum godly wives in training, and now they're single, middle-aged, and living at home with their lunatic father and brother, who seems like he's going to be a part of the next Ruby Ridge. Allegedly, that is. And I'm not even going to bother giving a conclusion about Lucas. You can see 100 dudes just like him sitting in his car outside of AutoZone, yelling slurs out the window of his modded WRX, blaring, "Nobody gonna tell me how to live," on blown out subwoofers that cost more than his transmission. Alright, well I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I tried to do something cool there with using a different camera, but it didn't work out. So that's what happens when you try. So the moral of the story is to never try. Shouts out out to Modesty Files. I linked their episode that talks about the stay-at-home daughter movement in the info box. I have not done a podcast with them yet, but I have done an Instagram live with them, and we talked a couple times. So check that out, Modesty Files. And I also want to give mad respect to the bloggers who have been covering the Botkins and Vision Forum for decades now. Their information is extremely invaluable, and without those dedicated bloggers from back in the 2000s, the Fundy Snark and deconstruction communities would be nothing like they are today. So I really appreciate that. This is why journalism and free press are so important in our society. Websites and blogs that I got a lot of information from were Spiritual Sounding Board, Under Much Grace, No Longer Quivering, Free Ginger, Reddit, Rethinking Vision Forum, and Homeschoolers Anonymous. Once again, recommend Quiverful by Catherine Joyce. I don't recommend So Much More by the Botkin sisters, although it is fun to make fun of it. And one more thing, I don't think this is gonna happen, but the Botkin sisters went after a Quiverful blogger 10 years ago and tried to sue her, so hopefully that doesn't happen. But I ain't afraid of them. I'll fight them. Can you hear that? I thought that was James vaping, but it's some sort of power tool outside. I love you guys. This episode took me a long time to make for circumstances outside of my control. Next week is a James episode, and then the week after that, I got something really, really fun planned for you. Remember to consensually smash that like and subscribe button if you enjoy my content. As always, I have all my sources in the info box below. Follow me on social media, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.
Here is your pink rule book. And I'm really thankful for that. And that was that one.
Okay.
We are, can we, cut it?